Welcome to the story history forgot. Kafele Nzinga of Angola, a name buried under silence, power, and brutality. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what device you're on, and if you value deeply researched history based on verified, true data that takes real time and effort to uncover. Please subscribe and support this work, because stories like this only surface when curiosity meets commitment. Kafele Nzinga is a figure surrounded by silence, fragments, and historical gaps, which is exactly why his story is so compelling. Unlike widely documented African rulers, Kafele Nzinga does not appear clearly in mainstream history books, not because he lacked influence, but because much of Central African history was recorded or erased through colonial lenses. What survives about him comes from scattered oral traditions, regional accounts, and indirect references tied to pre-colonial Angola's complex power structures. He is believed to have lived during a period when Angola was not a single nation, but a network of kingdoms, clans, and warrior states, each governed by strict hierarchies and spiritual authority. In this environment, leadership was not inherited casually. It was earned through military strength, political intelligence, and the ability to command fear and loyalty at the same time. Kafele Nzinga is remembered as a ruler who embodied these traits, rising within a system that rewarded dominance and punished weakness. The name, Nzinga, itself carries weight in Angolan history, often associated with power, resistance, and sovereignty. While later figures like Queen Nzinga overshadow earlier bearers of the name, historians believe Kafele represented an earlier, more ruthless model of leadership, one rooted less in diplomacy and more in control. His authority was said to extend over both land and people, enforced through discipline, ritual, and violence when necessary. What makes Kafele Nzinga particularly difficult to define is the absence of a single, agreed-upon narrative. European chroniclers largely ignored figures like him unless they directly interfered with trade or colonial expansion. As a result, his legacy survived mostly through oral memory, stories passed down, altered over time, but consistently portraying him as feared, decisive, and uncompromising. Understanding who Kafele Nzinga was requires accepting uncertainty. He is not a polished historical hero, nor a clearly documented villain, but a reflection of a harsh era where survival demanded brutality. His story challenges us to look beyond sanitized history and confront the uncomfortable truth that power in the past, especially in regions later colonized, was often remembered only when it served someone else's narrative. Before European colonization reshaped its narrative, Angola was a region of deep political sophistication and cultural complexity. It was not an unstructured land, as colonial accounts often suggested, but a mosaic of powerful kingdoms such as Congo, Ndongo, Matamba, and smaller warrior states that governed through defined systems of law, tribute, and spiritual authority. These societies had established trade networks, agricultural systems, and military hierarchies long before foreign contact altered their course. Power in pre-colonial Angola was closely tied to land control, lineage, and spiritual legitimacy. Rulers were not simply political figures. They were seen as intermediaries between the physical and ancestral worlds. Rituals, oaths, and sacred symbols reinforced authority, making leadership both feared and revered. In this environment, obedience was not optional, and punishment was often severe, reflecting a worldview where stability outweighed individual life. Economically, Angola thrived through regional trade long before European involvement. Ivory, copper, salt, iron tools, textiles, and agricultural goods moved across vast distances, linking inland communities to coastal regions. These networks fostered alliances and rivalries alike, creating a competitive political landscape where leaders like Kafele Nzinga could rise through warfare, negotiation, and calculated displays of power. European arrival disrupted this balance by selectively documenting what suited colonial agendas. Complex governance systems were reduced to stereotypes of chaos and savagery, while internal conflicts were exaggerated to justify foreign control. Practices that were culturally regulated became labeled as barbaric, stripping them of context and nuance. This distortion erased the legitimacy of indigenous authority and reframed African power structures as inherently violent and inferior. To understand figures like Kafele Nzinga, Angola must be viewed as it was before colonial distortion, a land governed by its own rules, values, and systems of survival. Without this context, his actions appear as isolated brutality. With it, they reflect a broader historical reality shaped by competition, belief, and the constant struggle to maintain sovereignty in a world on the brink of irreversible change. Kafele Nzinga's rise to power did not come through inheritance alone, but through force, strategy, and calculated dominance. In pre-colonial Angola, leadership was constantly contested, and authority had to be proven repeatedly. Oral accounts suggest that Kafele Nzinga emerged during a period of intense internal rivalries where clans and factions competed violently for land, resources, and influence. In such an environment, survival favored those who could impose order through strength. His ascent was marked by military success. Warfare was not only a tool of expansion, but a test of legitimacy. Victories on the battlefield elevated status, attracted followers, and weakened rivals. Kafele Nzinga is believed to have used decisive and often ruthless tactics, sending a clear message that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Fear, in this context, was not accidental. It was a deliberate instrument of rule. Beyond military power, Kafele Nzinga understood the importance of symbolism and ritual in establishing authority. Public displays of punishment, sacred ceremonies, and the control of spiritual figures helped reinforce his dominance. By aligning himself with ancestral power and traditional belief systems, he positioned his rule as inevitable and divinely sanctioned, making rebellion not just a political act but a spiritual risk. As his influence expanded, so did his control over people and territory. Tributes were demanded, loyalty was enforced, and dissent was crushed early to prevent wider unrest. This consolidation of power created stability for some and terror for others. For supporters, his rule brought order in a violent era. For opponents, it represented oppression with no room for negotiation. Kafele Nzinga's authority was therefore not accidental nor purely tyrannical. It was forged in a brutal system where leadership required constant assertion. His rise reflects a broader truth about power in pre-colonial Angola. Rulers were shaped by conflict, and authority belonged to those willing to enforce it without hesitation. The political structure under Kafele Nzinga was built around centralized authority, reinforced by hierarchy, fear, and obligation. Unlike modern state systems, governance was deeply personal. Power flowed directly from the ruler and extended outward through trusted elites, warriors, and spiritual intermediaries. Loyalty to Nzinga was not symbolic, it was enforced through tribute, military service, and unquestioned obedience. This structure ensured that decision-making remained concentrated at the top. At the core of his rule was a council of selected advisors, often drawn from powerful families, military leaders, and spiritual figures. These individuals did not serve as equals but as extensions of Nzinga's will. Their positions depended entirely on continued loyalty, making betrayal rare and dangerous. This system discouraged dissent within leadership ranks, as removal from power often meant death or total social exclusion. Below this inner circle were regional enforcers who governed villages and territories on Nzinga's behalf. These local authorities collected tributes, food, labor, captives, or resources, and ensured compliance with Nzinga's laws. Failure to meet demands resulted in swift punishment, often public, reinforcing the ruler's reach even in distant regions. Governance, therefore, was not based on negotiation, but on visible consequence. Law and justice under Nzinga were harsh but consistent. Crimes such as disobedience, rebellion, or refusal to pay tribute were treated as threats to stability rather than individual offenses. Punishments were severe by modern standards, but within the context of the time, they were meant to deter chaos and preserve centralized control. Mercy was rare and calculated, used only when it strengthened authority. This political structure created a state that functioned through order maintained by fear, ritual, and loyalty. While it ensured Nzinga's dominance and territorial stability, it also bred resentment and silent opposition. His governance reflects a system designed not for fairness, but for survival, where power was absolute, and the ruler's authority defined the political reality of the land. Warfare was the backbone of Kafele Nzinga's power, and his military strength was the primary reason his authority remained uncontested for so long. In pre-colonial Angola, war was not an occasional event, but a constant reality, driven by competition over land, trade routes, and political dominance. Nzinga understood that a ruler who could not defend territory or expand it would quickly lose legitimacy. His armies were organized around disciplined warrior groups loyal directly to him rather than to local chiefs. This reduced the risk of internal betrayal and allowed for faster mobilization. Warriors were trained from a young age, conditioned for endurance, and prepared for close combat fighting. Loyalty was reinforced through rewards, status, and shared participation in conquest, making the army both a military and social institution. Nzinga's tactics relied heavily on speed, intimidation, and psychological warfare. Surprise attacks, nighttime raids, and the deliberate destruction of enemy symbols were common strategies. Villages that resisted were made examples of, ensuring that neighboring regions submitted without battle. Fear became a weapon as effective as spears or blades, spreading Nzinga's reputation far beyond his actual borders. Terrain played a crucial role in his campaigns. Nzinga's forces used forests, rivers, and elevated ground to their advantage, launching ambushes and retreating quickly when necessary. This knowledge of the land allowed smaller forces to defeat larger opponents. Warfare was not about honor or formal engagement. It was about efficiency and outcome. Through relentless military pressure, Nzinga maintained control and expanded his influence. However, this constant state of warfare also created exhaustion among the population and deepened resentment among conquered peoples. His military success secured power, but it also planted the seeds of future instability, as rule maintained by force alone demanded continuous violence to survive. Kafele Nzinga's rule is remembered not only for its strength, but for the extreme brutality used to maintain control. Violence was not random, it was deliberate, calculated, and often public. Punishments were designed to be seen, not hidden, serving as warnings to anyone who considered defiance. In a time where authority was constantly challenged, Nzinga used fear as a governing tool as much as law or tradition. Accounts passed through oral history describe severe penalties for disobedience, rebellion, or betrayal. These included executions, forced labor, exile, and the destruction of entire households tied to accused individuals. Collective punishment was common, reinforcing the idea that resistance by one endangered all. This method discouraged rebellion by turning communities into self-policing units driven by survival. Brutality also extended to conquered populations. Captives taken during warfare were often used as laborers, sacrifices in ritual practices, or traded to strengthen alliances. Such acts were not viewed as cruelty within the context of the era, but as demonstrations of dominance and control. Nzinga's power depended on the constant reinforcement of hierarchy. Those above ruled absolutely, and those below obeyed or suffered consequences. Psychological control was just as important as physical violence. Nzinga cultivated a reputation that exaggerated his cruelty, ensuring that many regions submitted without resistance. Stories of his punishments spread faster than his armies, breaking morale before conflict even began. Fear became a silent enforcer, reducing the need for continuous military action. While these acts secured Nzinga's authority, they also defined his legacy as one of terror and oppression. His rule highlights a harsh historical reality. In unstable political landscapes, brutality often replaced diplomacy. Understanding this does not excuse his actions, but it explains how control was maintained in an era where power survived only through relentless enforcement. Despite Kafele Nzinga's tight grip on power, resistance never fully disappeared. Beneath the surface of fear and enforced loyalty, rival factions, displaced clans, and oppressed communities quietly searched for opportunities to challenge his rule. In pre-colonial Angola, rebellion was not always open warfare. It often took the form of sabotage, refusal to pay tribute, or secret alliances formed beyond the reach of Nzinga's enforcers. Some resistance emerged from within Nzinga's own political structure. Local leaders and regional governors, though outwardly loyal, resented the heavy demands placed upon them. Excessive tributes, forced labor, and the constant threat of punishment created deep frustration. When Nzinga's attention shifted to distant campaigns, these figures occasionally attempted to reclaim autonomy, testing the limits of his authority. Rebellions were typically swift and violent, and so were the responses. Nzinga understood that delayed punishment invited wider unrest. When resistance was uncovered, he acted decisively, crushing uprisings before they could spread. Entire settlements suspected of supporting rebels were often destroyed, sending a clear message that opposition would lead to collective ruin. However, not all resistance was defeated through force alone. Some groups fled into difficult terrain, dense forests, remote valleys, or border regions where Nzinga's control weakened. These communities preserved their independence by avoiding direct confrontation, surviving outside the central power structure while waiting for moments of political instability. The persistence of resistance reveals the limits of Nzinga's control. While fear maintained order on the surface, it could not eliminate opposition entirely. His reign demonstrates that even the most brutal systems face constant pressure from within, and that authority built solely on force is always vulnerable to collapse once that force begins to weaken. European contact marked a turning point in the world surrounding Kafele Nzinga, introducing new pressures that reshaped power dynamics in Angola. Early encounters with Portuguese traders and missionaries were not immediately colonial invasions, but strategic engagements centered on trade, influence, and control. Firearms, foreign goods, and new trade routes altered existing balances of power, intensifying rivalries among local rulers. For leaders like Nzinga, Europeans were both an opportunity and a threat. Access to weapons and trade alliances could strengthen military dominance, but dependence on foreign powers came at a cost. European traders often manipulated internal conflicts, supporting certain factions while undermining others to secure resources and human captives. This interference destabilized traditional political systems that had previously regulated warfare and diplomacy. Conflict emerged as European interests expanded beyond trade into territorial control and religious dominance. Indigenous authority was increasingly challenged, with Europeans portraying African rulers as illegitimate or brutal to justify intervention. Figures like Nzinga, whose rule relied on force, became convenient targets for narratives that framed colonial presence as civilizing rather than exploitative. European records from this period are deeply biased, emphasizing violence while ignoring context. Brutality that existed long before European arrival was exaggerated to erase indigenous ingenuity, while European-led violence and exploitation were minimized or justified. This selective documentation contributed to the historical distortion that later defined Nzinga primarily through cruelty rather than political reality. Ultimately, European contact did not just bring conflict, it reshaped how history itself was recorded. Nzinga's legacy became filtered through foreign eyes, stripped of nuance and cultural context. Understanding this interaction is essential because it explains why figures like Kafele Nzinga appear fragmented or demonized in history, while the forces that destabilized their world remain largely unexamined. The story of Kafele Nzinga exists today in fragments largely because of deliberate historical erasure. As European powers expanded their control over Angola, they also controlled the narrative. Indigenous rulers who did not align with colonial interests were either ignored or reduced to stereotypes of savagery and chaos. Nzinga's name, power, and influence faded not due to insignificance, but because his story did not serve the colonial record. Much of Angola's history was preserved through oral tradition, passed down by elders, storytellers, and community memory. These accounts were rarely written down and were often dismissed by European historians as unreliable. Over time, war, displacement, and forced cultural changes weakened these traditions, causing many stories, including Nzinga's, to be lost or altered beyond recognition. Colonial documentation focused heavily on figures who interacted directly with Europeans, particularly those who could be framed as allies or enemies. Leaders who ruled primarily through internal African systems, like Kafele Nzinga, were sidelined. This selective preservation created massive gaps in the historical record, making it difficult to reconstruct his life with certainty today. Even after colonial rule, post-independence narratives often prioritized unifying national heroes, leaving controversial or brutal figures unexamined. Nzinga's legacy, marked by violence and authoritarian control, did not fit neatly into modern identity building efforts. Silence became easier than confronting the complexity of the past. This erasure matters because history without uncomfortable figures is incomplete. Ignoring Nzinga does not erase brutality, it erases understanding. Recovering such stories challenges simplified narratives and forces a deeper examination of power, survival, and memory in African history long before colonial domination reshaped how the world remembers it. The story of Kafele Nzinga sits at the uneasy intersection of myth and limited documentation. With few written records and heavy reliance on oral tradition, separating fact from exaggeration becomes a challenge. Over generations, stories about his cruelty, power, and dominance grew larger, shaped by fear, memory, and cultural storytelling practices that emphasized moral lessons over precise detail. European records, often treated as official evidence, present their own problems. These accounts were written by traders, missionaries, and colonial administrators who viewed African rulers through a biased lens. Violence committed by leaders like Nzinga was highlighted to justify foreign intervention, while the broader context of political norms and survival strategies was ignored. As a result, documented evidence often reflects colonial agendas rather than balanced truth. Oral traditions, on the other hand, preserved emotional truth more than chronological accuracy. They portrayed Nzinga as a feared ruler, sometimes almost supernatural in authority. While these accounts cannot always be verified, their consistency across regions suggests a core reality of his impact. Myth, in this sense, becomes a vessel for historical memory rather than pure fiction. The challenge lies in reconciling these two sources without privileging one over the other. Written documents offer dates and events but lack cultural understanding. Oral history provides context and meaning but evolves with time. When combined carefully, they reveal a more nuanced figure, neither a legendary monster nor a misunderstood hero, but a ruler shaped by a violent era. Understanding the difference between myth and evidence does not weaken Nzinga's story, it strengthens it. It reminds us that history is constructed, often by those in power, and that truth must be approached critically. Only by questioning both myth and documentation can we begin to understand who Kafele Nzinga truly was. The story of Kafele Nzinga matters today because it challenges how history is remembered and who gets remembered at all. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and leadership long before colonial rule. Ignoring figures like Nzinga creates a false narrative that brutality only entered Africa through foreign influence, when in reality, complex and often harsh political systems already existed. This chapter also matters because it exposes how history is shaped by those who record it. And Nzinga's near erasure shows how colonial documentation determined which African leaders were remembered and which were silenced. Understanding this helps modern audiences question historical sources and recognize bias rather than accepting written records as absolute truth. Nzinga's story invites deeper conversations about leadership and morality. He was neither a simple villain nor a misunderstood hero. His rule reflects a time when survival demanded extreme measures and where authority was maintained through force. Examining such figures helps us understand how societies evolve and why certain systems eventually collapse. For African and global audiences alike, revisiting these histories restores complexity to the past. It honors the reality that African history is not a single story of resistance or victimhood, but one of internal dynamics, ambition, and consequence. This understanding strengthens cultural identity by grounding it in truth rather than myth. Ultimately, this chapter matters because forgetting it weakens our understanding of humanity itself. Kafele Nzinga's legacy reminds us that history is not about comfort, it is about clarity. By revisiting overlooked and brutal chapters, we gain insight into how power operates, how memory is shaped, and why truth, even when uncomfortable, must be preserved.